So here's the thing, the ProArt laptops from ASUS have always been on Intel platform because Intel's been the better one for creators, and this is the creator lineup. But the thing is, Intel got fired because the new one is not Intel anymore. This is the first generation where we have AMD Ryzen AI chips in here. The question is, how do these two actually compare? Maybe firing Intel was a bad idea after all. Let's find out. This part of the video is brought to you by Motion Array and their brand new AI voiceover feature. I'm going to show you how it works in this sponsored segment, but if you're impatient, go check it out in the video description below and get $50 off.
Navigate to the AI voiceover tab over at motionarray.com. There you can listen through
different voice catalogs and sort them by
gender or video category.
Select the voice type and insert in the preferred text. You can select the desired language. Change the speed and emotion to fine-tune the voiceover. Once you're happy with the settings, hit generate. Your generated voiceover will appear under my voiceovers. If you'd like to change the voice, go back to the voice catalog.
Select the new voice and generate the new version. Once you've found the voiceover that fits, you can download it by clicking the arrow.
And it's as simple as that. Go check out Motion Array and their brand new AI voiceover feature in the video description below and get $50 off. Thanks Motion Array for sponsoring this part of the video. I want to start by looking at the specs side by side. So what we have is P16 and SB16, which is StudioBook 16. StudioBook 16 is the older version, P16 is the newer version. You can see that the CPU difference, we have Ryzen AI 9HX370 CPU and i9 13980HX CPU, which is not the latest of Intel's and not the Core Ultra from Intel either. The Intel version has 24 cores and 32 threads altogether, whereas the new version we've actually cut down a little bit on the cores. Now, interestingly, AMD still is running a little bit of a kind of a hybrid thing there. It's 8 P cores plus 4 P cores. Some of them are a little bit different cores. It's still 2 threads per core, so 24 threads. But the interesting thing is there is 12 P cores on a laptop, which hasn't been possible before. Interestingly, the Intel one boosts up to 5.6 GHz, whereas the AMD one 5.1 GHz. The AMD version here, the P16, has the DDR5 soldered onto the motherboard, even though now the Ryzen AI 9HX CPUs, the 300 series, can support SODIMM as well, but by the time ASUS ProArt was making this laptop, the SODIMMs weren't supported and they wanted to release the laptop, so you'll have to just stick with your RAM, whatever you configure from the get-go. Interestingly, AMD has always been known to have more cache on the CPU, but not on the laptop department. Actually, Intel has quite a bit more, 36 megabytes compared to the 60 megabytes on the AMD. The max supported RAM on the ProArt is 96 gigabytes because SODIMM, we have easily 48 gigabyte SODIMM sticks that you can put in there and upgrade it to 96, whereas on the P16, we only have 64 gigabytes. But because the RAM is soldered, they can actually run it a lot faster at 7,500 megatransfers per second compared to the 5,200 megatransfers per second what I have on the ProArt. The SODIMM sticks that I actually have in there are 5,600, but the BIOS of the laptop is, you know, clever enough to actually pull the frequency down a little bit because it can't support 5,600 megatransfers per second on 64 gigabytes and above. Now, the power draw on the older one is quite a bit bigger. 170 watts max what I can see pulled compared to the 80 watts on the new one. On battery, the old one actually pulls a little bit less power, about 32 watts compared to the 35 watts on the newer one, but they're roughly about the same. They both have the iGPU with the 16-core Radeon 890M integrated GPU in there. It's good on specs, but we don't see the integrated graphics actually do quite a bit. The Intel version does have UHD 770, which is the same that we have on the desktop, which is a very good iGPU for the media playback as well on some of the video editing applications. We don't see the Radeon GPU being utilized as much. If you'd like to see my Premiere Pro DaVinci Resolve actual tests, then go check them out on my channel. Interestingly, the dedicated GPU on both of these laptops is the same NVIDIA RTX 4070 mobile version. And as you can see from the process node, the P16 is on a lower or smaller process node, which often means better power efficiency and cooler temperatures. So let's take a look at that straight away. Firstly, we're going to be looking at Cinebench R24. Because we're approaching these laptops from creators' perspective, there's a few things things I want to test out here. And what we can see is the StudioBook 16, the older version, is kind of our baseline, and the P16 is what we're comparing it to. Looking at the single and multi-core performance, the newer one is actually about 8.7% slower in single core score and about 27% slower in the multi-core score. So was it worth firing Intel, or what is going on in here? If you're looking at the multi-core in 10 minutes, I'm testing the throttling here, we're 24.7% slower, and in 30 minutes about 28% slower. When the new P16 actually throttles even more down, the kind of gap goes even bigger. So we're almost 30% slower on the new P16. But when looking at the single battery, so now we're unplugging the laptops and then running them on battery at max performance settings, we can see that the P16 now only 4.6% slower, because the Intel's gonna have to lower its power limits and the single core score is not as fast anymore. When you're looking at the multi-core score, that's where something amazing happens. The new P16 is 50% faster compared to the older version, which means, and what it looks like, is they fired Intel for actually improving the battery life performance, not the ultimate performance. And if you look at the third and fourth column there, you can exactly see that. We're comparing the battery percentage versus plugged in percentage. And you can see that the StudioBook older version lost about 15% performance, whereas the newer one loses only about 11% performance, which is better when you unplug it. And when you look at the battery performance, the old Intel version loses about 64% performance when you unplug the laptop, whereas the new P16 only loses about 26% battery when unplugging the laptop. So I can see why Intel's being fired. So let's take a look at the rest of the performance then. Now, very importantly, before we move on, you've got to remember that this Cinebench R24, a test what you just saw, battery versus plugged in, is the worst it can get. Some of these applications are not utilizing the CPU 100% and is not so multi-threaded or so single thread. So this is the worst case scenario, very synthetic. In actual workloads, you're probably going to be losing a little bit less because you're not always that utilizing, you know, multi-core performance and single core performance and so on. So the rest of the benchmark, what you're going to see now, are both of them plugged in to test the ultimate performance on both of these laptops. So Geekbench 6 for single and multi-core CPU performance, we can see that the new P16 is about 3.5 to 11.7% slower. So this is PutureBench for Photoshop. You can see that the new P16 is actually faster. Even though Cinebench scores showed us that the ultimate CPU performance is on Intel's side, in actual applications, the new process node probably just makes the performance per watt a little bit better, and the IPC is a lot better on the AMD, and we're about 7.8% faster in the overall scores, 1.2 in general and about 14 in the filter score. In Lightroom Classic, we see very similar results. The new P16 is about 12% faster in the overall scores. The active score is slightly slower, but the passive score is 23% faster, which is insane because the passive score is where the multi-core is actually utilized. Now, I'm not sure if Lightroom Classic can utilize the P cores and E cores at the same time, as well as all of the 12 P cores here, what we see on P16. But to see that the new P16 being 23% faster in the passive scores, which utilizes the multi-score, is absolutely insane, even though the older one in multi-core scores is quite a bit faster.Moving on to video editing, and here we see that actually perhaps now Intel was a little bit of a better option. We see that the new P16 is about 1.2 to 2.7% slower in the extended and standard overall scores. Now, because Intel has the iGPU inside, which has the media engines that can decode some of the very, heavy codecs like H.265 10-bit 422 footage, which we can't do on the AMD. Even the NVIDIA RTX can't help you in there. The new P16 is about 18.2% slower in the long GOP scores and about 12% slower in the standard long GOP scores. That's when we're working with H.264 and 5 codecs. Now, if you're not working with H.264 or 5 codecs, actually there's some good news. The interframe, you can see the new P16 is 5.9% faster. Raw score extended is 7.8% faster, and the GPU score is a little bit faster as well. The interframe standard score 8% faster. The raw standard score is better actually on Intel, about 4% slower on the P16, and slightly slower GPU effects on the P16 when doing GPU effects on the standard effects score. So a little bit of a mixed bag, but I'm very excited to see that the AMD and Nvidia combo is actually starting to be very equal to Intel. In some of the cases, look, about 7-8% faster when working with raw codecs compared to the Intel one, but still quite a bit slower on the H.264 and 5, which means I really wish AMD or Nvidia would just provide support for certain H.264 and 5 codecs so we could actually get really nice smooth timeline performance on their platform as well. Moving on to After Effects, interestingly, the new P16 actually crashed. I couldn't get the benchmark working. No matter what I tried, different versions, it was just not working. Now, that doesn't mean that After Effects is not working on the P16. It just shows that my Geekbench benchmark for After Effects for some reason just wasn't working in there. It's a very common problem. Often that happens with new devices. So stick around for the future videos. Maybe we can get it working and then finally I could get these, uploaded in the future videos. Hit the like button. It actually makes a difference, and subscribe if you haven't already. Now, Geekbench for DaVinci Resolve on both of these devices. The StudioBook 16, the old version, actually didn't manage to run the extended benchmark, which tests some of the extended codecs and resolutions and so on. But the new one, P16, I was able to complete, as you can see, the extended overall score and some of the extended tests as well. That doesn't mean that the Intel device can't do the extended scores. For some reason, just the benchmark didn't quite work for I don't know what reason. Now, the basic overall score means testing DaVinci Resolve on the free version that you don't have to pay for the license. Now, the free version of DaVinci Resolve, there's a few things that you need to know. On Windows, it doesn't utilize all of the hardware on the free version, and hardware accelerated playback on certain codecs is just not working on Windows until you go for Studio. Whereas on the Mac OS, it does actually work, some of the H.264 and 5 codecs. So we can't compare Mac versus Windows devices exactly for this benchmark on the basic overall score, because interestingly, different hardware is limited. The standard and extended do start to utilize the DaVinci Resolve Studio and some of the hardware playback, just so you know. We're looking at the overall basic, and we can see that the P16, newer one, is about 8.3% slower. The standard overall one is about 6.2% slower. Maybe firing Intel wasn't that good of an idea for DaVinci Resolve. The Fusion is 21% slower. GPU effects about 2% slower, not that big of a difference. Raw score standard about 6% slower. Interframe, interestingly, is about 1.6% faster, and long GOP about 1.5% slower. Interestingly, the long GOP there is only 1.5% slower, and I believe when leaving the benchmark on auto, it doesn't actually utilize the Intel iGPU for certain codec playback. So if you do utilize or use H.264 and 5 codecs and you see a little bit of a choppy playback, highly recommend forcing the media engine to actually utilize Intel iGPU or Intel graphics for the media playback, because then you'll get even higher long GOP score. Moving on to Blender, and interestingly, the Blender benchmark doesn't work on the new P16. I have no idea why. Maybe the Ryzen AI 9 chips aren't utilized on Blender open source benchmark yet, but for some reason it's not working. But when we want to see 3D performance, we can look at the Cinebench R24 and V-Ray. So V-Ray is also another option where we can utilize the CPU performance, and the new P16 is about 13.3% slower, which I would expect to see roughly about the same results in Blender. And looking at Octanebench here, we utilize the RTX GPU on both of them, and you can see we're basically getting the same score. They're within 0.3% of each other. So the GPU performance when plugged in rendering is the same on both of these devices. The GPU rendering performance. Firstly, when plugged in performance, looking at both of these devices, the new P16 is about 1% faster, which is within margin of error and no difference really. But looking at the 10-minute and 30-minute tests, something interesting starts to appear. So 10 minutes, we're running the same test 10 minutes to check how much is the device throttling. Perhaps when it's getting hotter, it starts to pull down battery. How much can it utilize still the same power and push the same performance out? You can see that the P16 starts to gain a little bit of performance between the newer and older model, up to 2% now faster in 30 minutes, meaning that the cooling performance is a lot better on the newer version. There is actually one extra fan there as well, so that kind of makes sense. Where the old version StudioBook 16 actually falls apart is on battery performance. When unplugging the device and trying to get the best performance out, we're only getting almost 5,000 points, which is 74% faster on the new device. So if you're looking at rendering or utilizing the GPU on battery power, the new device is a lot better at doing that and a lot better at maintaining and pushing the power through on battery. Now, Now, performance is only one side of the coin. We should also check out some of the actual features on both of these devices. One major thing that you see on the new device is that the new device is a lot lighter. Holding it in your hand, you can feel that it's so much easier to carry it around. Putting them side by side, you can see that the new one is kind of one whole lid thinner. And to push still that much power out, that is a lot nicer because it's a lot more portable than the older version. When looking at the trackpad, you can see that the older one had quite a big trackpad. But then when moving on to the newer one, that's when the trackpad gets really, really big. Okay, it's absolutely massive, but they've actually taken a little step backwards with the trackpad. The old trackpad is actually a haptic trackpad, which is very nice to use. The new one is actually on a hinge. I guess why they had to make it a little bit thinner, the device, because they can't fit the haptic motors there. But in a lot of the ways, I prefer the old trackpad, not the new one. Obviously, the new device is marketed a lot with AI capabilities, whether it's Ryzen or GeForce, AI. The old device doesn't have an NPU, still has some AI capabilities with the NVIDIA RTX. The new one is better. Now, how much do you use it? That's another question. In terms of power break, the newer one actually comes with 200 watt power break and the older one 240 watt power break. So the old one does utilize more power. The old one uses a barrel plug, whereas the newer one, ASUS has invented their own new plug, which is a little bit thinner and skinnier. That starts to be on future devices to make the devices smaller as well. In terms of build quality between these two devices, I've actually got to say that the old one, even though being bigger, the build quality feels better. Everything that you touch on the old one feels solid. Just the screen lid, that doesn't flex at all. It feels very solid. The hinges are solid. It just feels like so robust. Now look at the new one. Look how much there is screen flex on the newer one. Look at that. Can you see? Now, design-wise, I like that this is a little bit more minimal. You have less shapes. I like the speakers on the side. Although my personal workflow, I really like the numpad. I do wish that they had the numpad somehow in there as well. Now, let's do a speaker comparison. Okay, there's absolutely no comparison. The new one being thinner is so much better. There's so much bass, so much more clarity. Compared to the older one, it just feels very tinny and just not as good. So the speakers are massively improved. Now, one of the main things creator needs in a laptop is the screen. And comparing these two screens, we've actually taken a slight step backwards. Let me explain. If you look at the pure resolution, the newer one, yes, has more pixels per inch. We have 4840 times 2400 pixels. So 16 by 10 aspect ratio, the same as the older one, just more pixels crammed in. The previous one was 3.2K OLED. Now the newer one is a 4K OLED. One of the biggest things I complained about on the old version review was that why do we have 120 Hz OLED screens? ASUS kind of listened because creators, I'd say, they don't necessarily need 120 Hz. Interestingly, when talking to Sasha at IFA 2024, who's one of the main ASUS guys, and I was asking him the question, why is the refresh rate gone down? He actually said that the refresh rate isn't gonna make that big of a difference in terms of battery life performance, which I thought that's why they would take it down, to give better battery life performance. Apparently the refresh rate doesn't make that big of a deal. Now, knowing that it doesn't make that much of a difference, we've gone down from 120 to 60. The newer one is only 60 Hz. Now, once you've had 120 and having 60, the 60 feels very choppy. Even though the performance, if you could match the performance on both of the devices just by having 120 Hz, feels so much more fluid, so much more smooth, the experience on the screen. So we've taken a step backwards, and we've taken a step backwards in terms of max brightness. If we are looking at the max brightness on both of these devices, the new device goes up to 400 nits and 500 nits on HDR. The old version goes up to 500 nits and 550 in HDR. So for some reason, the panel kind of is a little bit lower. In terms of color accuracy and color gamut, they're absolutely fantastic. Both of them super color accurate, delta E less than 1, 100% TCIP3 color space, so that you don't need to worry about, and both of them are 10-bit as well. And lastly, the big thing that you might see difference is the ASUS dial. The newer one, if we are just holding on to this little button, as you can see, this little dial lights up, and now we can use this in there for different things. On the previous one, that was actual physical dial. I really like the physical dial a lot more. Now, I know it takes a lot more space, but in terms of tracking and how nice it feels a lot better in there. I've had a bit of issues on both of these devices getting the dial actually to work and, you know, make it useful in Premiere Pro and so on. If you've had this device, I'd love to know if you have used the dial before and what's your experience been like. Mine's kind of been 50-50. In conclusion, was it a good idea to fire Intel or not? Well, that depends what you're doing. I like the thinking behind going forward with the new device. It's slimmer, and we've gone with AMD because we get better performance per watt, a lot more portable. What I don't like is that we're still sacrificing performance compared to the previous model. I guess that makes the previous model still worth it. If you can find this on a deal, and I'll try to leave both of the links in the description below. I know the old one can be a bit more upgraded in terms of SODIMM, and you have 2 M.2 slots. The new one has 2 M.2 slots as well. Go have a look at my overview on the teardown to actually see what's going on in the newer one as well. But the old one still might make sense, because in a lot of the ways, the old one still holds the performance and is better if you can kind of get away with the power brick and not so much portable performance. The newer one has much better portable performance, but ultimate performance is a little bit lower. So I can see why they fired Intel. Was it a good idea? Well, I'd love to know from you in the comment section below. Let me know what you think. Bye bye.